This podcast may contain paid advertisements, but more on that later. Welcome to the O'Connor Bootstrap Podcast, your go-to resource for unraveling the intricacies of business and leadership, honing in on the essence of bootstrapping a business from scratch. Whether you're a seasoned entrepreneur, a dedicated bootstrapper, or a leader navigating life's various challenges, this podcast is crafted just for you. I'm Isaiah O'Connor, your friendly neighborhood entrepreneur, and my mission is to guide you towards personal and professional growth. Let's embark on this journey together. Okay. So today we're going to change things up. I recorded this episode almost 9 months ago. Yes, this is another one of the episodes I recorded before the kids got out of school, and once the kids did get out of school, I lost all my momentum, and I am now finally trying to get caught up. This is due to a whole bunch of life stuff that came barreling down at high speed at us. Knocked us a little bit off balance, but I'm back, and one of the things is I'm going to focus on just the podcast. I might still do a blog once in a while. I might update blogs ever so often, but I found I can't blog and podcast and do a video cast or anything like that all at once. It's just too much. But the reason I'm going into such a detail like this is details I would normally reserve for the mid-break. But upon editing this podcast, I realized that my total content on this podcast was well over an hour long, which is much longer than my normal 30-ish minutes podcast. So instead, I am now going ahead and dividing this podcast into 3 separate sections because it's just too long. So this will now be part 1 that we're going into, and because it's part 1 and it's a shorter part, I am not going to do a mid-episode break this time. You're getting it up front. I'm going to do an intro to each episode instead of a mid-break because, again, I had to cut it up instead. Okay, let's go ahead and get to the podcast. Okay, welcome back. I am trying to get content out at a higher pace. Hopefully I can do this as my kids will be out of school soon, which will make it interesting to do so once a week. But we're trying. So today we're going to address something that is both current events and also an evergreen issue, as it were. This is an issue I've talked about before. It does skate political ideology. However, I will make sure to try to stick to facts and data because this is an important subject which affects all business owners and needs to be looked at because this is one of those things that I've talked about in my series about politics and business that you need to pay attention to because this subject directly affects the way you run business. Very important. It is political. However, I'm going to avoid being political versus, I'm not going to say I'm left, I'm not going to say I'm right. I'm not going to say vote for this guy, vote for that guy, or I support this guy or support that guy. None of that. This is not going to be political in that sense. I'm just going to address the raw data as best as I can. Now, what I'm talking about today is what is a living wage and should you be forced to pay a living wage as an employer? Does minimum wage count as a living wage? And is minimum wage even really something that we need to have? Well, as far as the minimum wage, when they were talking about a $15 an hour minimum wage increase nationwide, I recorded a podcast titled Minimum Wage, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which you can go find in my library. If I remember when I upload, I will try to link that into the show notes as well. But to nutshell that, there was not much good I found about minimum wage. Looking at it, there was some negative stuff, which is definitely there, which I'm going to go over again today. And for example, minimum wage raises business cost, which can raise the cost of pretty much everything else. It can drive inflation. Minimum wage lowers wage growth or slows wage growth because, honestly, minimum wage, if that's the only wage that a company has to pay, well, then that's all they will pay. It stifles competition in the market to get employers to raise their lower wage entry so that they can be competitive to attract employees. They don't do that. They just say, oh, no, we don't have to. So they don't. So, yeah, I go on for quite the long rant on that in the previous episode. And now I'm going to do that on this episode. But more focused on the living wage viewpoint here. Now, the reason I'm jumping in, this reason why this is now a current event issue, is that California just raised the minimum wage on fast food restaurants to $20 an hour. And the evidence from how that happened is quite interesting, what that caused. The whole idea was we're going to raise minimum wage to get rid of poverty because we need a living wage to be paid so people don't starve. That's kind of the political selling point, I guess you'd call it, the speech that. So let's look, does that happen? Does raising minimum wage help people? Does trying to give a living wage to people actually give them a living wage? Let's look at this. So, let's look at the reality of what happened when California raised the minimum wage. The first thing that happened was they lost about 10,000 jobs in the food industry. 10,000 jobs. Let's see, according to the Hoover Institution and DNYUZ, as soon as the law took effect, 90,500 job losses between last fall when it was announced and between now, as of January 2024, 1,250. So over 10,000 jobs were lost pretty much immediately. The Pizza Hut chain I used to work at, some 15 odd years ago, whatever it's been, they immediately fired all their delivery drivers to save cost, especially since they no longer need delivery drivers because of DoorDash and other such apps where you can just have other people deliver, so they don't need to keep a staff of delivery drivers on staff anymore. They can just use Fedora and save the money. Now, if I had been living in California and working at Pizza Hut, I would have lost my job. That would have hurt my my living wage to zero, which would be bad. Okay, so losing your job, having zero income is definitely not a living wage, just as an aside. So let's continue. Major food chains. But from Hoover Institution and DNYUZ, McDonald's, Burger King, and Subway have had to raise their pricing, cut employee hours, and close some of the locations completely. This is a major financial strain on these businesses. It's not good. Closing down an entire store, there goes those jobs. Sure, you being paid more per hour, but now you're being paid, you're only working half the time, and sure, you're making more than you would as a part-time employee, but you're still making less as you were as a full-time employee. By the way, if I remember correctly, I can double check. This was a wage jump of $5 from $15 an hour to $20 an hour, if I remember correctly. I can be fact check on that, but point being is fast food employees were already making $15 an hour, which was not great in today's day and age, but still making $15 an hour, 40 hours a week versus making $20 an hour, 20 hours a week. You lose money. You lose money completely in that trade-off. So, not good. Now, the problem is that the discussion seems to be conflating the idea of a minimum wage and a living wage. These two things are not the same thing, although they're often blended together. Now, per definition, the minimum wage is defined as the legal minimum hourly wage that employees must pay employees. Now, this wage is often, as I've noted, criticized for being insufficient to cover basic expenses like housing, food, healthcare, etc. in high-cost areas. Now, in contrast, a living wage is deemed the income level required for a worker to afford the necessities of life based on the specific cost of living in a particular area. Advocates argue that workers should earn a living wage rather than just the legal minimum wage to achieve a decent standard of living. They actually believe that raising this minimum wage to a living wage can lift people out of poverty, and they often cite stats of a single-parent family relying on minimum wage jobs. Now, well, they cite a specific example, which is fine. Well, I will deal with that as well. The exact same example, matter of fact, later on if I remember. But first, let's look at some stats, shall we? If a higher minimum wage works to lift people out of poverty, let's look at the stats on who's working these jobs and if they need to be lifted out of poverty to begin with. Okay? Now, some of these stats are a little bit older, some are a little bit newer. I was struggling to find the most recent stats, but we'll work with what we got. The majority, this is from heritage.org, the majority, which is 53% of those earning minimum wage, at the time of this, it was $5.15 or less per hour, were between 16 and 24 years old. Most young minimum wage earners are not primary breadwinners. They typically come from middle-class households and are either in school or working part-time. Contrary to popular belief, only 70% of them live at or below the poverty line, with 65% having a family incomes well above twice the poverty line. So, the majority of those working minimum wage are not providing a living wage for themselves and are not at or even close to the poverty line. Let's continue. Characteristics of older minimum wage earners are being 25 years old and above, revealed that more than half of them work part-time. So they're working a part-time minimum wage job. Their average family income, at least this time, is $33,606 annually. Significantly above the poverty line. Again, these are from 2016. These stats are a little bit older. So, you can extrapolate out that this has probably not changed all that much. And only 3% of those live in poverty, with 45% of them having incomes over twice the poverty line. Well, how can you have an income, just as a side, twice that over the poverty line with a minimum wage job? Well, you can do that because the minimum wage job is not your sole income. It's an additional income usually. They also tend to be better educated than younger minimum wage earners, with the majority having completed high school or some college education. A notable portion, 43%, are married. That could explain why working minimum wage job, they still have a higher annual income because they're not the only one earning money in that household. Despite the perception, only a small percentage, 6.1% of minimum wage workers over 24 years old are single parents working full-time. So 6.1%. That's a tiny, tiny percentage. Now, in more recent demographic insights, I do believe these are from 2020, I believe, 2018, something like that, but a little bit newer, show that about 45% of minimum wage workers are under 25 years old, with many, 60% still living with family, indicating reliance on familial support. Teenagers, ages 16 to 19, comprise about 10% of those earning the minimum wage, compared to 2% of workers aged 25 and older. So, only 2% of minimum wage workers are over the age of 25. 10% are teenagers, which is interesting. The rest are somewhere in between. Women are slightly more likely than men to earn the minimum wage, with minimal variation across racial groups. That would make sense to a degree, because from this is just an observation. I did not catch this when I was writing this up, but I'm guessing that's likely to a lot of the minimum wage jobs being more focused on the service industries, servers and such, because more often than not, when I go to a restaurant, most of the servers are female. My mom was a server waitress. I've seen a lot more waitresses than I have seen waiters in general. So maybe that could be a factor. But again, not sure on that. Don't quote me on that one, because that'd be an interesting to examine. Now, education also plays a significant role, as those without high school diplomas are more likely to earn the minimum wage compared to college graduates, which is interesting, because this stat that I pulled up seemed to miss those with a high school diploma. It mentioned that with high school diplomas are also more likely to earn better. So, in conclusion on these stats, the demographic and economic realities of minimum wage is essential to understand the policy decisions. And this is why you need to pay attention to these wage increases and vote and contact your representatives when they try to push for a higher one. Because the reality is, most people do not live off of a minimum wage job. They're living at home, have it as a second job, are retired, or part of a family contributing to the household income. Now, as an aside, a small story, just a personal anecdote, which is, and I'm going to get into it a little bit further after the mid-break here, but I knew a single mom in my neighborhood, in my church growing up. She worked at McDonald's. I do believe she started off at minimum wage, but she worked her way up into more of a like a shift manager role or something. She made a little bit more money than just minimum wage. So she worked at McDonald's during the day. She got government help to get housing. She had the people in the church babysit her kid while she went to night school to become a nurse. My family was one of the families that babysit her kid. So her kid stayed with us. Family full of boys. We had so much fun. Had great times with this kid running around all night long, multiple days a week, because his mom was going off to school. She finished school, left McDonald's and became a nurse. And I think at the time she started making like 60, 70,000 a year, which this was 20 some odd years ago. Maybe it was like 45 to 50,000, but it was a significant increase over the some 10,000 plus dollars a year she was making working McDonald's as a single mom. So yeah, things were rough on her. She represents only 6.1% of the people, and even though she was kind of forced into a minimum wage position, she did the best of what she could and got out of that position. So even if there's a small percentage of people who are struggling to survive in a minimum wage job, a single mom with a kid, the good news is there's lots of other help around. Like I said, there's government housing, there's paid help with childcare, they have communities that can help out, and they can go to school for relatively low cost when they're in that position because of government grants and assistance in going to school. So the raising the minimum wage is not the only factor to fix the problem. The problem was not fixed for this lady by raising the minimum wage up. The problem was fixed by this lady through help of her friends, her family, her church, and going to school and getting a degree and getting out. So, interesting things to do, to look at, to get out. So, we're going to call that a break as I go into some of the more of the stuff that is overlooked when all these factors come in, because we've just looked at the factor that it appears to be a myth that most people working minimum wage jobs are in utter abstract poverty. It's just not the case. Statistically, not true. Statistically, people are at home. Statistically, people are not living off a minimum wage or trying to survive on a minimum wage job. It just doesn't work that way. So let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll be back. And by break, we will see you next week, because instead of the mid-break, this is just part 1. Okay, thank you so much. I've been your friendly neighborhood entrepreneur. We'll see you next week for part 2. If today's episode added value to your day, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and consider giving us a stellar 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform. Whether it's Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, or more. And remember, if you leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, I will personally read it out in the next episode. To support the show, you can make a one-time gift by buying us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/bootstrap, donate through PayPal at paypal.me/IOCPOD, or make a contribution on our Patreon page at patreon.com/IOCPOD. Your support keeps the episodes coming. For even more content and exclusive perks, join our Patreon community at patreon.com/IOCPod. Patrons enjoy ad-free episodes, access to our private Discord server, early content previews, and a lot more. And here's an exciting offer. Get your free trial of our $5 a month Bootstrapper Community Explorer tier. This exclusive tier grants you ad-free content, Discord server access, and early content previews. Join us and be part of the inner circle. If you're feeling more generous, those who join tiers $25 a month and up will have a chance to be a featured guest on this podcast. A massive thank you to Winter Gotten for generously providing the incredible intro and outro music at no cost. We appreciate their support. Be sure to check out Winter Gotten's amazing work on YouTube at youtube.com/@WinterGotten. Until next time, I'm your friendly neighborhood entrepreneur, Isaiah O'Connor, signing off. This is the O'Connor Bootstrap Podcast, brought to you by Athos Business Solutions. For our companion podcast, the Athos Business Podcast, hosted by Jason St. Clair, along with past episodes and related blogs, visit our website at athos.com. That's ATHEOZ.com or theoz.com. Goodbye for now.